3, 2, 1, clap. Whoa, we don't need to clap.
Maybe we should just applause.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right.
3, 2, 1.
Superb.
Good job, gents.
And we're back in the room.
Is this really happening?
Yes, it's really happening, guys. Hey, folks, welcome.
Hey, Dave and Mark, welcome.
Hey,
Welcome.
Chris and Dave.
Hi, I can see you. You're over there. You're over there. You're not just on my screen.
Disembodied heads.
It's the first time, well, since Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another 9 months before that
and
as
we
well.
all know how Christmas ended.
I mean,
yeah.
I do. I don't think you do.
I don't think you. Nobody.
I was bluffing there, yeah.
Hey, folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast. As Dave says, we're back in the room. Yeah, hi, I'm Mark Fraser. That is...
David Weaver.
You
That's
should know
me.
that by now.
That's Chris Cusack over there.
Yeah.
I've heard some people say it is in the past, particularly if they're not from our country, that they can't tell who's who.
Really?
Yeah.
Should we all adopt a part of the vocal range and stick with it? Can I go really high?
I can go really low.
I'll go really medium.
It's great stuff, guys.
Flawless.
All right, here we go. Oh, I can't do medium. That's really hard to do. It's like a steak. Yeah, it's either.
So yeah, we are sustained by your loving and caring donations. And if you quite like what we do, you can go to our website, unsungpod.net/donate. You can give us a one-time donation via PayPal there.
AKA the tip jar.
The tip jar, or you can do an ongoing subscription on our Patreon, which is also linked there. We have many cool features, including some sweet-ass bonus content, which we're going to record some of again probably next week.
The bonus content's the best content. I mean, if you like this shit that we put out to the general public, you'd be absolutely wrapped with our bonus content.
Yeah, it's like the fat on bacon. It's the best bit.
It's like the wee white fake bit on tempeh that they draw
it's
on.
concentrated.
Right, Mark, so this week was your choice.
What? Aye. This is Circle Takes a Square, and it's their debut album, As the Roots Undo.
Rejoice, rejoice, I know I'm back. I'm pretty hard. The violence, time for our concrete master. And if we beg to be put down, unto us the most inspired storm. A princess ravaged.
Which I picked kind of a little bit influenced by Dave's choice last week. It was something I had listened to for a long time, and I've been thinking about doing them for a while. We haven't really done Screamo and what that means, and it means quite a lot, and I kind of want to talk about that itself, not just this kind of it, but also the mainstream kind of it, which doesn't really seem related to it. We'll talk about that in a wee second. And the more modern version of it, which is I actually like quite a lot.
Wrong.
All of that and more. So
Can we lay the groundwork here? Now, we spoke only about 6 weeks ago about how we had never and probably would try to avoid ever doing a math rock mixtape. And I thought, yeah, math rock, as much as on paper there's a lot of stuff about it that I like, it's so fucking punishing. This was fucking punishing.
yeah, I mean, as someone that actually likes this genre of music, listening to it solid for a week is not a fucking good idea.
How did you fare, Dave?
Oh, well, I mean, we'll talk about the album itself and how I sort of responded to that later. But it's interesting that Screamo, I was surrounded by Screamo fans at uni. I lived with like ultimate Screamo fan for like 2 years. It has a lot of things that I like, and yet I've just never really caught onto it. Certainly not early Orchid Screamo like this.
Skramz.
Yeah, exactly. There are a couple of bands that that I got into that definitely have big skramz influences, or could be a skramz band, but they weren't part of the scene. But yeah, it's a genre that I'm really tempted by, and then I try it, and I'm like, oh, yep, nothing's grabbed me, or it's really quite dissonant and annoying, or I don't know. And maybe I just never got into it at the right age. Maybe if you're 16 and feeling emotional and you get into it, then that's when it grabs you. But when I was 16, I just wanted to listen to Pantera, so didn't give a shit about this.
It rarely settles into a groove, and I think that's the thing. It's quite erratic. We'll talk a wee bit about that, but it's as a result, you're constantly bobbing about. Your attention doesn't get to just rest anywhere, and it's also very confrontational and full-throated, literally. So
But these pills we found just make me sleep. There's nothing quite so pure as the written word, my dear. So let's have ourselves a little poem.
mean, it's there's plenty of cool stuff to discuss about it, but it was really hard work this week, not gonna lie.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially when I've got like basically a 3.5 day hangover. My God, today I was just catching up and I was feeling, I just want to lie in a bath and listen to Mozart. I'm sorry.
So this was 2004, this album,
Yep.
but Screamo goes way before that and also way after that. So can we do like a really quick introduction of the band, and then I'd love to kind of take a look at the legacy of Screamo.
Yeah, so Circle Square are from Savannah, Georgia, and they kind of came about in the apex of the first wave, if you want to call it, of Screamo.
Savannah, Georgia, we've been there before.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of our Baroness episode.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I didn't realise that they were from Savannah, but like so much of that like stoner doom stuff came from Georgia and Savannah that this band didn't quite fit in.
I think there's a bit more of it on their second album, Decompositions. We'll talk about that in a wee second as well, because there's a lot of things that are interesting about this band in terms of how many records they've done, how long they've been a band, and how little they've done, even though they toured like fuck. So they came about in the year 2000, formed by Drew Speziale and Kathleen Coppola Stubelek, and also had a singer called Robbie Rose, a guitarist called Colin Kelly, and a drummer called Jay Wine, or Jay Winnie maybe, I don't know. Anyway,
they had a
lot of different lineups.
Yeah, Robbie Rose left before this album, I believe, because they're only a trio in this album.
Yeah,
they had a second guitarist, Colin Kelly, the second guitarist, Bobby, was it Scandifio or something like that, and David Rabitor. So none of them were there when this was recorded. They also had a variety of drummers, Jay Wynn, who I think was there until about 2004, so I'm assuming this one. Josh Ortega, Caleb Collins, but Drew Speziale and Kathleen Stubelek Coppola Stubelek, maiden name Stubelek, who married the band's sort of honorary fourth member, their producer and live producer and stuff like that. As you say, there's a lot of different people in and around them, but yeah, Drew and Kathleen, or Kathy, are the main ones. 2 albums, which is remarkable. This was the debut in 2004. Decompositions Volume 1, 2012, full 8 years later. They started as a self-titled EP in 2001, the year after they formed.
There isn't one.
Between that and this album, 2002, they released a split EP with a really significant early Screamo band called Page 99. Regarding their take on their music, I mean, the band are often quoted as having said that they just consider themselves punk rock from 2004. I don't think that's true. I think that's like sort of deliberately quite coy, because clearly there's a lot more going on in this music than just being a punk rock band. It's much more savvy and self-aware and all those time signatures and things like that. It is punk rock, but there's way more to it. They also, I saw some claims about them being pioneers of emotional post-hardcore scene. I think that seems like a little bit unrealistic, given, you know, the band arrived really in 2001 and this was in 2004. There's a hell of a lot happening, not least Far, who we've covered, and loads of other things with Texas the Reason and all that kind of stuff that were starting to blur the kind of screamy boundaries between melodic and interesting and post-hardcore and hardcore and stuff like that. So yeah, there was already a lot happening, but this is kind of widely seen as being, I mean, one of the most significant albums. I think it was like number 3 in Sputnik's top 100 albums of the decade in in 2010 when they were doing their 10-year retrospective. I mean, so that's like, I mean, Sputnik covers a lot of good stuff. That's high praise. It's seen as being one of the most influential hardcore, post-hardcore albums of all time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I definitely think they fit our unsung ethos quite well. They've not toured since 2015. They've not done anything musically since then, it looks like. I know Kathleen's in another band. I can't remember their name just now. She's in an indie band now. She's still quite active on Instagram. The band are still quite active on Instagram, just posting lots of pictures of old stuff. This record was seen as being quite influential, but it came about at a time when, I guess, who are they really influencing? You know what I mean? Like, it feels as though one of the things about this whole Screamo scene is that they were all just influencing each other, but it didn't really seem to be going much wider than that, which is fine. Music scenes can do that, and a lot of really successful music scenes do that, but this kind of music was never about that.
And they certainly weren't courted by major labels or anything.
Absolutely not. No.
It's interesting though, because so Screamo, the case I'm about to make is that it kind of breaks down into 3 eras, and the era that followed them, albeit it was a good 6 years at least after this album, but they were still about. They were still a going concern, and they were certainly, arguably, this is the most celebrated, critically celebrated Screamo album, full stop. The era that followed them did have commercial appeal. It had some really big commercial bands, and we'll get to that. So whilst they were not getting courted, and whilst the bands they were influencing in the immediate vicinity didn't really break through, around about just under a decade later, this genre transitioned into something with a lot of like mainstream appeal, albeit in a very modified form, a very shit form, which is why you're wrong to say it's good, Mark. But
you don't know who I'm talking about yet, so
yeah, no, I think and are you not talking about like even more modern?
Yeah, I'm talking about even more modern stuff, like more as in the last 5, 6, 7 years,
right? Well,
which is the third era, I would say.
Well, yeah, it certainly sounds like it. We'll debate that. I mean, just to give people a rundown that aren't familiar with it, we said skramz early on. That has become the kind of catch-all for the original batch, which we'll call phase 1 of Screamo, the sort of the OG. I mean, the origin stories of Screamo, as far as I can make out anyway, vary quite a bit. But a lot of people cite San Diego in the very early 90s. A lot of hardcore kids there picking up on some of the metal riffs that were kicking about, but also that kind of like West Coast thing in America, going down into like Latin America. There's a huge love of stuff like the Smiths and the Cure. And I think like fashion played a big part in Screamo. This is like one of the things we spoke about during Botch, and we've spoken about it in the context of Converge. You're playing with a lot of bands who were like long hair and black t-shirts, and suddenly these kids were showing up that were not dressed like that. They had like kind of cute bobs and sensitive guy haircuts, tidy shirts, or just a totally different take on the aesthetic. And yeah, I really think that, like I said, that look was such a huge part of it, and it's still in my head as one of the things that defined Screamo bands. I mean, they would sound like Earth Crisis, but they didn't come across like Earth Crisis, and they weren't singing about the same things as Earth Crisis, thank fuck, because that would be about how abortion is wrong.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. So that the Wikipedia entry on Screamo is actually the most accurate thing on the web for it, because it's really hard to find any definitive, quote unquote definitive history online. I tried really fucking hard, and I think it's really interesting that they seem to be pinpointed to an exact year in San Diego in 1991 as being when it really became a thing. And I always find that kind of thing a bit fascinating, right? Because usually it's movements that exist and like kind of swirl around in certain eras, but putting it into a specific place, specific time, specific venue is not really something that's done outside of punk. You know what I mean?
It seemed, the thing is though, even though it's credited as having maybe started there, it seemed to migrate to the East Coast.
Absolutely, because a lot of the most influential bands are East Coast bands, you know.
Like some of the earliest purveyors that are associated with it are bands like Heroin and Antioch Arrow. I mean, you also had this coming on the back of the emergence of bands like Dead Guy and the Dazzling Killmen, who were sort of like noisecore. They were kind of straddling their own part of this kind of alternative rock movement that we've talked about Helmet and all those kind of noisecore bands. There was a weird kind of no man's land there where some of these bands were sort of facing off against each other and in their corners, but not really that far away from each other in real terms, but they were associated with entirely different scenes. Apparently there's quite significance as well, because Tooth and Nail, the Christian label, started picking up on metalcore, and that seemed to play quite a big part in, you know, exposing a lot of suburban kids, especially in American Midwest, to a style of music that I guess was kind of off limits to them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's probably worth discussing, we've never done a metalcore record, right? But when we talk about that,
it feels like,
would you not say The Bled?
No, I would say that's probably closer to being post-hardcore, but we discussed that in the episode. Go back and listen to it.
Sorry, I'm not having that fight again.
Yeah, go back and listen to it. But there's a really rich strand of Christian hardcore, like metalcore from that whole. I guess when the second wave of Screamo was around, there's a really rich vein of that, which still exists to this day. Some of which are convicted guys that tried to get their wife killed.
By the way, I don't know if it seems obvious, we didn't mention this is clearly a portmanteau of scream and emo. Emo rock is a huge part of this, the emo movement.
For sure, yeah. I mean, Heroin sounded like Fugazi, but a bit more aggressive. Not super early Fugazi, but that kind of era Fugazi sound quite aggressive, much more aggressive. Antioch Arrow shared the same members as Heroin. Which is,
but yeah, I mean, just listening to like the clean parts, there's like little bits of the tapping and the arpeggios and stuff like that are so sort of mineral and American. What are they called again?
Head charge?
No, the cunts with the house on
American football.
Ah, right, okay.
American head charge.
No, I just want to give them a mention. Shout out to my boys. No, you're right. And the Deep Elm and Jade Tree labels and stuff, these bands were clearly like at that. And actually, I want to talk a bit about my experience with Screamo, and it was seeing them on bills with bands that didn't always sound very like them, because there was definitely a sense of solidarity between some of the kind of slightly heavier emo bands and the slightly lighter Screamo bands, and they went together pretty regularly. They would tour together. There's a lot of mutual admiration for it. I think it's also interesting to mention when it comes back that Screamo, that lyrical change, that sort of substantive change in the subjects, it was part of the emo movement was obviously trying to get away from the machismo of the 80s chest beating hardcore and the circle pits and things like that, and emo took that with it, became a little bit more introverted or a little bit more self-reflective is maybe a better phrase. Screamo has a lot of that, although it quickly became a parody of itself in the sense that it was people yelling about getting dumped, and so what initially seemed like a reaction to machismo actually sort of metastasized a wee bit into something quite sort of incel-y, and I think that's, you know, we're speaking just not long after the Plymouth shootings, which are just the latest example of like incel and men's rights and that kind of aspect, anti-feminism, and weirdly Screamo and emo have become quite associated with that, like sensitive modern guys resenting women for making them feel what they feel, and then actually ending up going, you know, full circle and ending up right back at the kind of machismo that they were initially trying to leave. And the whole time, this whole thing going under the radar and not being seen and called out as it should be, but that's a whole other conversation. I
feel like a lot of the bands in this sort of first era of Screamo are probably not as guilty as that as the second.
Totally agree. It hasn't yet metastasized. That's what I mean. It's like back then it still has that sort of innocence, it still has that sense of progressiveness that of emo, you know, getting away from the chest beaters. The gigs were much more evenly spread between men and women. It wasn't such an intimidating environment, and obviously bands came through like At the Drive-In that I'm sure we're going to mention shortly, who were very much, you know, outspoken on these things. Fugazi as well, clearly writing and singing about it, and they were all kind of kindred spirits in that sense. Phase 2 happened around about the 2000s.
So I'm going to agree with Bert McCracken from The Used here, and I don't do that ever, but there's one thing I will agree with him on, and is like, I think he says around about this time, he said, I think the word Screamo is just a marketing term. And I think that's probably true. I don't think this has very much in common. This is a Teenage Elite coming out to me, I suppose. I don't think the second wave of Screamo has altogether that much in common with the original stuff. I think it is basically...
I think as a portmanteau, it works for both types of music.
It does, yeah. That's what I was going to say.
The types of music don't actually have that much in common to, a half well-trained ear. Your structures are completely different. Your production quality is, so much different. It's just much more commercial and much more straightforward, I guess.
It basically takes the emotional parts of emo, the big sort of buried in my soul, and then, like you say, Chris, turn up to 11, it metastasizes into like pure, almost misogyny a lot of time. Combining it with metal a lot of the time too. The same kind of bands I think that were influencing metalcore bands are also influencing a lot of these Screamo bands.
That's very true.
Yeah, there's a huge crossover.
Yeah, absolutely. Because even when the Boston scene kicked off, the kind of metal scene in Boston, and even bands like Converge and stuff, their scene has been very influential, or obviously not part of this scene, but at times, sonically there was a lot in common with them. We mentioned Botch as well. Botch are one that are associated with it. Clearly turn of the century as well, like Refused and At the Drive-In,
absolutely
huge. Bands like slightly further down the ladder, Locust with their kind of gonzo thing, that played a part, because one thing these bands do is they chop and change direction and tempos a lot. Drowning Man, people like that.
Closer and closer.
I think the Midwest emo phase was maturing to a point that was slightly...
It became closer to indie, I think, the Midwest emo stuff, because then you started to get Bright Eyes and Cursive and stuff like that, which was moving more in that direction.
Aye, and it was getting toned down, and there was a group of people that weren't satisfied with that, so they pushed away and formed this thing. But as you say, it became quite close to marketing and itself. I mean, Screamo at this point became associated with Hot Topic.
Absolutely, because think about it, bands that start breaking through in the early 2000s, which is actually the same time this record comes out, so the same time as
we're talking about just as new metal is leaving, but there are still teenagers that want to listen to heavy music.
I've got, so there's a really good resource, a guy called Jim DeRogaitis. He did a Guitar World feature in 2002.
That sounds like the wrong... I don't know what the word looks like, but I'm going to guess that nobody has that name. Jim D. Rogaitis.
Rogatis maybe? I'm really shit with names.
Just press on, man.
I'm shit with names. Anyway, one of the guys... So he interviewed a bunch of people for this Guitar World feature, and one of the people he spoke to was... one of the guys for Poison the Well, Derek Miller, who are really not a Screamo band or an emo band.
But I can see the I can see the parallels.
It's already hard enough to say yes. Bad memories and good times.
And his first words are, everyone's want to put the nail in the coffin of new metal, which is pretty much what this is like. And then the guitarist for the Used is saying there's definitely a movement. Kids call it emolution.
Oh my god,
that's never popped up in the show.
What, mate?
Wow.
He said it's a new wave, it's a new setting on your amp, a new rhythm, a new dynamic inflection with your vocal. I'm like, so this guy was clearly not listening to fucking Orchid and Page 99.
That sounds like a press release, man.
Yeah, fucking. So, but this guy brings it back to Rites of Spring and Discord and saying these bands were influenced by that, but then bringing in lots of other stuff like Weezer, like the Get Up Kids, a little bit more heavier stuff as well. And then you get bands like Thursday and The Used and Thrice.
Yeah, I was going to say Thursday, The Used, Taking Back Sunday to some extent. Even like Norma Jean made a big impact on people from this.
Victory Records, I think, were massive. And they were the one that actually introduced a lot of this stuff to me. I can't remember. I went to some music conference and ran into the Victory Records stall and just met two very attractive American skater girls. And they just gave me a whole bunch of free CDs if I went and did free work. It was like a dream. But like I did end up just working for free basically for them for the whole day just because I thought they were hot. But they also gave me a bunch of CDs, and it was like fucking Silverstein, Taking Back Sunday, and Yeah, it was just I just remember Victory Records were a huge part of that whole movement.
Drive-through records as
and
well.
Drive-through, yeah.
I mean, they had a lot more pop punk. Don't get me wrong, but Finch were on that label. You know?
So can I throw something into the mix here? And it's actually related to something I was watching. I'm sure we're all aware of the Woodstock '99 documentary that's kicking about.
Yeah.
And clearly, as you said, like new metal, there was something unsavoury. There was something toxic that had become associated with it right at the turn of the century. You know, Limp Bizkit, for all their like switch off your brain fun, were also sort of the tip of the iceberg of like this big well of misogyny and nasty, manly.
It was like jock metal,
yeah, that was there. And I think as the new century arrived, there was definitely a growing repulsion with it, and there was a sense of like people wanting to kick away from it. So you had bands like Linkin Park trying to do a slightly more stylized, cool, emotional metal, you know, to sing about things that were more personal and depression and things like that, rather than I want to break stuff, you know. And then you had
metalcore happened as well.
Metalcore, but then you also had this group of kids that were coming up who didn't want to be these Luddites. They didn't want to wear backward caps and have chains and mesh vests and stuff. They wanted to wear t-shirts and jeans but still play some pretty intense music. There was also the fact that the early Screamo, I think, was associated with the DIY and underground movement. That was always what it was in my mind at that stage. And so there was a credibility factor with it. If you were playing that, you were the real deal. You weren't this giant stadium rock new metal band. You were something svelte and sleek and credible and cool and hip. And it was a lot more palatable, I think. There was that kind of self-awareness that it created a lot of enthusiasm. And even at this stage, I think there was still a lot of ties to the DIY scene. Yes, there was some bands starting to break through, and yes, bands that were tangential to it, like At the Drive-In, were becoming very big. But I mean, my experience of like the early 2000s, going to especially 13th Note in Glasgow, which was spoken about, which was for a long time the hub of foreign underground bands arriving in the city, was seeing bands like Song of Zarathustra. Their show sums up to me what I think people wanted from Screamo, because it made a big impact. I remember going to see this group. They were playing with, I think it might have been Stapleton or something like that. And Stapleton were a sort of, I don't know, Stapleton were kind of like very sort of like Jade Tree-ish, intricate, mathy, you know, like a very cool band, but not particularly aggressive, very thin vocals and stuff like that. And it was someone like Stapleton, if not them. And Song of Zarathustra came on stage, kind of good-looking young guys, very nice haircuts, you know, tight t-shirts, jeans. It was kind of like, what the fuck is this going to be? Absolutely no idea. And I remember being at the front of the stage because I just didn't expect anything, hadn't heard them, I'd just gone on to see. And they're like counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and literally before the cymbal had stopped ringing, the singer was halfway up the back of the room, absolutely thrashing about, just like going for it, like full on Screamo. And yeah, the songs broke into like little song bits and stuff, but the impact of that, seeing these guys who didn't look like crusties or who didn't look like metalheads, but they were really fucking heavy and confrontational, I think that's what a lot of people saw in Screamo and wanted a bit of that. They were like, oh, I can try and look hot, I don't have to look like antisocial, but I can play music that's still really intense. There's just something in the package of the whole thing that I think was quite appealing to young males especially.
But what's funny about that is then only 3 or 4 years later, and I was obviously a bit younger than you, came from the Highlands, and I went to see Taste of Chaos at the SEC.
That would be the place, yeah.
With like, what, 8,000 people there. And in 2005, I think the lineup was Funeral for a Friend, The Used, Killswitch Engage, Story of the Year, and Rise Against, maybe. So you've got like, there's definite Screamo there with, you know, the modern Screamo with The Used, and then Funeral for a Friend.
I would put them in that. I'm not Screamo, but I definitely put them in that emo bracket at the same time.
But then you've also got the metalcore of Killswitch Engage as well. But what was interesting there was it had been like packaged and consumerized and made into a product for the 18-year-old. We didn't have Hot Topic, but what did we have? We just had, you know,
we had Flip.
Flip
and similar.
But what was also interesting was the gender mix. So many of my pals who were girls fucking loved that shit.
Yeah, definitely. Like, it opened it up a lot.
It really opened it up.
There was a sex appeal side to it as well. I mean, we're all young. we kid ourselves on that we're not, but you know, there's a lot of hormones kicking about, and there was something about the screamo and emo movements. I mean, remember the band Finch? Finch, I think, were like the commercial edge of screamo, in that they would just a few times in their songs really deliberately sort of launch into something really throaty, but they also had these big ballady sort of singing choruses and stuff. And that was fucking, like, honestly, that was like nectar.
Burt McCracken was a bit of a sex symbol for the disturbed goth.
Total wild card of a guy.
And who else? Even like, I mean, I guess the guy from Taking Back Sunday. They're a bit more emo.
Yeah, Adam Lazar. Ian Watkins.
Oh no!
See,
he was in the mix at that time.
The thing is, I always associate Lost Prophets much more with new metal. I know they're British,
absolutely,
so they don't fit, but
same, man.
That, you know,
it's because that first album
Shinobi Dragon Ninja.
Yeah.
It's just like, that's like somewhere between.
But they became the emo band. They were touring.
They were genuinely, because they were like Funeral for a Friend meets
30 Seconds to Mars. Like, that's they were playing with that kind of shit in America. You know,
they had a fair bit. They were like Funeral for a Friend meets Linkin Park.
Pretty much.
What I wanted to mention about that kind of era is that, out of all the bands that existed around about this time, there's very few of them which I would actually say would have listened, like I said, to the original bunch of records. One of the guys that I absolutely know for a fact did and took influence from it was Jeff Rickley from the band Thursday.
Watch them all go on the endless shadow side. Watch them all.
Thursday are a really interesting band in a lot of ways. They're not really for me, but they've done a lot of really cool things throughout their career, including break up a couple of times.
There's a couple of Thursday records that I really like.
Yeah, they did a split with Envy when Envy had become like a post-rock band. They did a lot of really interesting things. They were always kind of moved around that movement, and they did have their moments, but his voice, and they had keys, and they were really abrasive sometimes as well, almost to the point of being Screamo, like original Screamo. It's no wonder they get signed to a major label then dropped after 2 albums, because they're just, people thought, they've got bangers, they can write bangers, but then they just would not write bangers.
Yeah,
you know. And Thrice as well, another one who I think are personally one of my favourite bands. They started off as like a sort of kind of techie metal-y band. Started doing this emo-y post-hardcore stuff, and then I've just kind of went off on a kind of mathy alt-rock tangent ever since the late 2000s. And they're no longer part of that conversation anymore, but they kind of cut their teeth as touring with bands like Funeral for a Friend, and I don't know who were huge in America at the time, that were like Finch and they used that kind of shit. And they're still going now, and I think they're new. They've got a new song out which is like really synth heavy and stuff. But they're still going and doing really interesting shit.
So I mean, I guess what that brings us to is phase 3, the 2010s and the big bucks. And at this point, it really did change, because this is when there was a new batch of smaller bands appearing. Where you got like La Dispute. Pianos Become Teeth, Touche Amore, things like the releasing stuff on Death Wish, which had that credibility factor, but then the production was getting slicker, the hints of like the older DIY stuff that was still sort of present in that second wave of Screamo bands was really starting to go, as things like autotune even started to arrive, you know, for the big notes. They wanted the big notes to be dead commercial. They were pushing for radio play. They were pushing for things to be as syncable as possible as this music could be. I mean, this even ended up leading to things like Attack and stuff like that. You know, that grew out of this weird third movement.
I feel like the third movement kind of split in two.
It does,
It was like
absolutely.
there were the folk like Defeater and Pianos Become the Teeth that are like, go back down the hardcore route.
And do the spoken wordy vocal thing, screaming and all that, and don't really sing at all.
And then there's the bands that I literally never heard of, but they've got fucking millions of plays.
Devil Wears Prada and Under Oath. And
yeah, exactly. That went down, just grew their MySpace to maximum capacity.
Yeah, Touche Amore are one of my favourite bands of recent years. You know, they've been a really interesting journey. Jeremy's a lovely guy as well. Fucking great vocalist, but he's only got one note. You know, he's a talky kind. He's a talky sort of screamy guy. That's the only thing he does, and he knows that. And when I interviewed him on my old podcast, he said that this is all I do. Like, I can't really sing. This is just what I do. But I fucking love doing it. And they're now an Epitaph and Sore Pianos Become the Teeth, and they've kind of made their way. But I think that's probably their ceiling. They're never going to go to a major label because they just don't have any commercial appeal in that sense.
Well, I mean, Devil Wears Prada are multi-platinum.
Yeah, but they don't sound anything like a band like La Dispute or
they sound more metalcore.
Yeah, they're way more metalcore for sure, man.
I mean, it's a genre that metamorphosed but didn't die. I mean, 2018, I remember Noisy and Vice quite famously called it the summer of Screamo.
Yeah, Dan Ozzy's one of my favourite writers, not only just because he did Tranny with Laura Jane Grace, but he was the only person at Vice and who did Noisy and was like the only proper punk guy for a long time. He's always been one of my favourite writers. He does a really good podcast with another good writer called David Anthony. I think it's got some, I can't remember the name of it, something about you're not getting in. It's about basically being on the guest list, but they just talk shit about music. And they're both fucking great writers, and he's super sound. And that series of A Summer of Screamo, I think he just started it off just by talking about the older stuff, and people just kept sending them emails. Check out this band, check out this band, check out this band. And that led to me coming across things like Headwind City, which were obviously the Locust and Yeah Yeah Yeahs. Had Loma Priete, who are great. Narrows, I guess, would be part of that scene too. And yeah, Touche Amore, obviously. The Saddest Landscape, pretty good. Birds in Row, who are great too.
Yeah, really good.
Birds in Row are fucking brilliant. Their album, You Mean the Violence, is superb. Portrayal of Guilt, who released an album last year and are probably more black metal-y now, but really did start off as like a screamo band. And that's something that happened, was like the merging of black metal and screamo, and bands like Death Heaven and that whole vibe.
I mean, I think given the fact that the early roots of it are so subversive, the fact that it's become so mainstream and so sanitized and overproduced in some quarters makes it ring all the more hollow. Stuff like pop punk always had pop punk. It always had a melodic accessibility to it, but Screamo had the pretense of being difficult and off-putting, and your parents are like, oh, what's this noise, turn that off. And to try and turn that into mainstream commerce seems so much more contrived and so much more devoid of real meaning in the end. It's a bigger contrast, so that's why I think the Screamo now seems so laughably irrelevant to my life, just generally.
I would say that the bands like Touche Amore and the bands like La Dispute and Pianos Become a Teeth, even though they've got one vocal and that's all they do, I would say they sound a lot closer to like the quieter moments in Circle Takes a Square or Page 99 than they do to something like The Devil Wears Prada, or I guess even fucking, Attack, like you said. These bands who are just
Black Veil Brides, Asking Alexandria,
Escape the Fate,
yeah,
that kind of shit. Brutality will prevail. They're kind of more hardcore, I guess. But
some of these guys still have emo fringes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we go into the album itself, I just want to it's not a scientific observation, but just my personal instincts on Screamo. In some ways, it was certainly initially cool to hear dynamism and musical force, I think, in the context of emo. That was nice to hear emo get a little bit more
Hardcore.
edgy and less whiny, and equally it was nice to see hardcore get a little bit less butch and a little bit more thoughtful for a while at least. It was definitely exciting for a bit, but I have to say that very quickly what seemed apparent with a lot of the imitators that came out, because there were a fucking lot of Screamo bands that hit the scene, was that there was very little melody and very little hook. When they ran out of ideas in a song, they would just scream, and as such it made it very easy to write to that formula. You know, there was Screamo had this giant fucking get out clause, this giant lever that you pulled anytime you ran out of ideas that was just fucking scream. And it was really cheap, and you would go and see these bands and it'd just be these howling fucking waif-like guys with like cute haircuts. It's just like, fuck me, man, you're doing that again. And it did get really, really difficult. They could play, a lot of it's quite technical, but they couldn't write a fucking tune. It was like Screamo landfill, and it was so forgettable. And I'm sure there were bands within that probably deserved more attention than they got, but people were so jaded to constantly getting this fucking lowest common denominator, like tappy tappy tappy, screamo screamo screamo, tappy tappy tappy, and it just it did form a bit of a wave, like an indistinguishable fucking wave of stuff that I think probably turned a lot of people off. Now, Circle Takes a Square always stood out to me as one of the bands that were better than average, always, like from the early days. What we've not mentioned is that Screamo happened in conjunction with the internet. The way I found Screamo was through file sharing sites.
Yeah, Soulseek was how I found it.
Epitonic was the one for me, where they used to sort of lead you to other bands of similar likes, and the bands themselves could submit tracks and put a wee description, and you would get into all kinds of stuff from that.
It was also just when Last FM had started, when I started getting into this.
Yeah, and so these bands really latched onto that, and that created a scene, and so the bands that were getting linked to each other became part of a kind of grouping of bands that formed a kind of collective unit. And and so I guess to me it's not a genre that's had a lot of longevity. I think a bit like math rock, it was momentarily impressive. I think you could go and see it sometimes and it totally hit the money with the energy, but then the takeaway was music that wasn't always, like, you didn't really want to go back to it. So this was a difficult week of listening, I'll be honest. As much as, like, as I say, cerebrally you can appreciate it, fucking not a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in a sense, it has quite a lot in common with something like grindcore. You know, it's these guys can clearly play, or these guys and girls can clearly play, but it's not something I'm going to be listening to on the reg, because it's hard work.
It's quite an interesting gateway, and it was quite an interesting output for my aggression at that point. Or, you know, you'd get, I remember listening to this record.
Infantile aggression, and that's
exactly.
It sounds infantile.
Yeah, I mean, it was 15 years ago when I first heard it, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm into that a bit. And then you give it 6 months and then you move on.
You should. Yeah, that's the thing. It's a music that I feel you grow out of, because its expression is so basic. It's so just like, and you're like, okay, but no, can we break that down a bit? No.
This record, for instance, is a lot more cerebral, but also more interesting than, say, a lot of the fucking second phase metalcore.
Yeah, hence why this stands quite markedly out from the pack.
I was going to say, I think when I think about Screamo, there's only really 5 bands that I think about, because the rest of it is all just much of a muchness. So Orchid, Chaos Is Me is a great album. I really like Page 99, Document Number 8, brilliant. Document Number 5 is also great. City of Caterpillar, also really good. Circle Takes a Square, obviously, and Envy. You know, the first Envy album's the second Envy album, sorry, all the footprints you've ever left and the feed expecting ahead.
Yeah, I saw them do that at Nice and Sleazy.
Fantastic album.
Do you know the band that I actually got into, and the record that I really got into that this reminded me of, and I know it maybe came a couple of years after, but it was Fear Before the March of Flames.
Yeah, they were cool.
I really liked them, and their record, The Always Open Mouth, I really caught on to because it just maybe didn't quite have the chaos. I had bits to hang on to, and it was maybe a bit more alt-rocky and a bit more metal-y just in terms of its structure, but in terms of its aesthetic and its sonics, it was very similar to this, but a lot more forgiving. So
before we talk about this album, should we talk about Decompositions?
Not really.
No.
Well, it's interesting that it's just like so after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, they spent so long just working on it. I read an interview with him saying when they were getting ready to do the release of the 10th anniversary vinyl of As the Roots Undo, so that would have been 2014. He was talking about how they took so long to do it because they just didn't want to rush it along. I think as an album, it sounds like they've completed their mission.
I'll dissolve in this realm and reclaim what is mine.
One of the things I really like about As the Roots Undo is that it's got a lot of ambition, but they're not quite good enough to pull it off. Whereas Decompositions is, now they can pull it off, but the ambition is maybe not as energetic as it used to be. You know,
they've definitely slowed down, and they're doing sort of maybe like some post-metal-y stuff and some post-rock stuff. But they've kind of lost the edge. And you're right, they're not playing at the edge of their ability anymore, or beyond their ability at some points. Yeah. And it's not, I quite enjoyed having that record on maybe in the background, but I mean it doesn't seem like a vital record in any way. It's just an album that's like 8 years after this band were important.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of good songs on it. Out by the Narrow Gates is really good, better production, better sounding guitars. Better playing, nicer reverbs. The Wave of Our Branching Path sounds like something they'd try to do on As the Roots Undo, but it's got a much tighter structure, feels a lot more considered.
Were they a quartet by the time they did?
Yeah, and they had a better drummer, a different drummer who was clearly better. Yeah. But I mean, back then they were all wee guys, you know. So
one of them was a wee girl.
They're all wee folk. There's a really cool triple vocal part with a sludgy outro and signal fires, which is prefaced by signal fires, which is dead good. And there's a really bit of nice creepy synth and a real heft towards the end of Arrowhead's epilogue as well. But it is not as vital, as Dave says, as the Roots Undo.
Just before we go in, I just, like, as I was talking about Last FM, I went on to Last FM for Circle Takes the Square. And maybe my favourite one is, this is just Bring Me the Horizon for Nerds. Well, yeah, I think that's what we could have just said that instead of talking for 40 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Funny.
Yeah, totally.
Dope. You want to retake? Mark, do you want to take us through the album itself?
So I want to start this off by saying I think this is actually as true an emo record as any other emo record ever made.
No, it's not.
In terms of the emotional aspect.
Let's just dispense with niceties.
The emotional aspect of it, like, it relies a lot on emotion without being sincere, which a lot of early emo did as well. And I think it's a great album because it feels dead raw and passionate, and it's just everything I like about punk rock, even though it's not a punk rock album.
Well, they claim it is.
They claim it, but we both know talking shit.
Can we also make a mention that it was Drew Speziale that did the artwork for it, and the artwork's amazing.
Yeah,
the really beautiful sort of lilac and gold / brass hand drawn thing on the front. It's fucking gorgeous. Really a kind of intricate and organic line quality to it that
it makes it stand out from a lot of emo records of the time, I guess.
Generic,
it doesn't look metal in any way.
Emo records with their understated small font.
Although it does kind of look like it could be like And also the title sounds like it could be a Neurosis record.
It does, actually.
Yeah.
It's true. I think it's also just looking at that cover, you really understand that it's a labour of love, because that artwork is a labour of love. It's very intricate. There's a lot of time being spent on it, and I think as a result, the record's cover, okay, it's a bit cult, but it's quite iconic within that. It really deserves a mention. Can we also point out as well, before we wade into the tracks, that as well as the names we've checked, like Page 99 and Orchid and stuff like that, this is a band that cited Godspeed You Black Emperor, Built to Spill and Modest Mouse as big influences in this
and
album.
toured with a couple of them as well. I think.
Which is really unusual. So that will maybe explain some of what we're about to describe, because you're probably expecting us to, if you've not heard this, you're probably expecting something quite different.
Yeah, as a landmark release, simply because it takes more risks than a lot of other Screamo bands were absolutely doing. And like Dave said, sometimes they're playing like beyond their abilities, like beyond what they can physically play, and that limitation is great. I think, you know, the fact they try to push past that, I think, is
they're not. Yeah,
cool.
they're doing a lot of virtuoso stuff without being virtuosos. They're doing stuff that maybe Converge could easily pull off, but they can't. But they still fucking do it anyway. Which is maybe what makes it a bit punk rock.
Yeah. So it's got an intro which has got that kind of whistling leitmotif which kind of recurs throughout the album. Straight away, once you've listened to the record and go back to listen to it again, you're kind of realising these guys are thinking about it in a slightly different way. They're thinking about how to create an album as opposed to just a whole bunch of songs jammed together like Orchid. And don't get me wrong, I fucking love Chaos Is Made by Orchid, but it doesn't feel like a cohesive work of art. And like you said, the artwork underlines that, I find.
It has a proggy quality to it. It has a concept, even though there's no explicit concept, it has a sense of cohesion.
It makes me wonder about Savannah, Georgia itself, right? Because Baroness were doing that kind of thing. I Hate God, all the sort of swampy, sludgy stuff going on down there. You know, these bands that actually take music as a concept as opposed to just a bunch of tunes you want to rattle out.
Probably just a coincidence.
It kicks off proper with its same shade as Concrete. So I was 18 when I first heard this album. It was not long after it came out because I was a moderator. I think I've spoken about this before. I was an admin, on the Funeral for a Friend forum back in the day.
Those were the days.
And this is when they first came out as a band. Before that forum got completely nuked, and there was a lot of people on that forum that were really into this kind of music, like this kind of screamo, and were forever lecturing every cunt for going, I really don't like the second Funeral for a Friend EP because it doesn't really sound as hardcore as the first one. By the way, listen to fucking Ampere or listen to Orchid, and you're like, okay mate. So when I first heard this, it totally blew my mind because I hadn't heard anything like it before in my life ever. I hadn't even seen it live, you know. And it's really just discordant. It's kind of grind. And I now realise that it's actually quite grindcore in a lot of ways. The way it starts off and just is quite furious, even though the time signature is a bit weird. They're also a bit all over the place at the same time, which I think is kind of endearing. It doesn't always feel like they're quite playing together at the same time, but it works because you always get to the end at the same time, so it's fine. It's also got that really hardcore bit, you know. It's like there's like a tremolo picking riff, which feels a bit hardcore too, and then it's got the first melodic section, and that kind of really kind of clues you in as to how this album's going to go.
Stop the music. Hold the heartstrings and chords. Patterns that confuse our histories. With the disheartened chorus of a hymnal whose choir.
Right, they're going to do a heavy, hard, fast part, and they're going to do a melodic section. And that's just going to be the structure. Where these fall in the songs and the record is anybody's fucking guess. But that's the kind of the two tricks that they really have.
There's some vocal moments in this that don't sit too well with me. I think there's like a really forced vibrato in it that reminds me of, it sort of lies somewhere between Conor Oberst and Cedric Bixler, and it just it feels hammy, like it feels like a bit contrived, and that didn't used to bother me, but it bothers me now. You know, when I first listened to them, it wasn't that big a deal because I quite liked Bright Eyes and I certainly liked Desaparecidos, but yeah, it doesn't age well. I also think a couple of times they do that thing where they drop down to spanky guitar, like clean, like chicka chicka chicka.
Yeah.
And it just sounds weak. I mean, it used to be a real gimmick, but it's just a bit. It just loses its power now.
Yeah.
I hated it when people did it live as well.
Do you know? I was thinking. I was driving through Shawlands, listening to it quite loud, and it was hot, so I had the window down. I wasn't like showing off that I was listening to loud music. But like, I'm not generally.
Who's that guy?
I'm not generally embarrassed by what I listen to, and I don't give a fuck really. But I don't listen to it too loud.
But given some of the things you listen to,
yeah, exactly. But but there was a point where I got to the traffic lights, and I had this quite loud, and I was like, I might turn this down because I think they might think I'm 14, just because the vocals are like. I'm like, oh no, I'm not into this anymore.
At its better moments, I think this song sort of summoned my memories of early Rollo Tomasi.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot to be said for this band's influence on them. The dual vocal attack and having a female vocal just so up front at the time was completely unheard of in the genre. Right, there was no other female singers, and having two vocals.
Is that true?
So I can't.
I don't. I mean, maybe high. I'll grant you high profile, but I mean, I saw quite a few.
Yeah, I mean,
female singers. Certainly on the European underground, there were quite a few.
The bands that you would call influential in this scene, are none of them have females in them at all. And the dual vocal thing was only done by a couple of bands, but not.
But it took off though with like Blood Brothers and all that.
It started to be a thing after this for sure. But it was kind of unusual at the time, and again for me that was a nice little fuck. Like I never really heard it done like that before. Funeral for a Friend had dual vocalists, but it wasn't like this. The middle bit is kind of where it goes down to the really quiet bit when they're not doing the chicka chicka guitar bit, with a weird dun, which is like you kind of sort out that weakness in the second album by just basically recording everything better and using better guitar.
But the thing is, only having one guitar as well.
Yes,
it's hard to fill it out. We'll talk about that later, actually, at one particular part.
But the middle bit when they go to wade in the water is quite nice, and I like the way that builds up into almost a thrash metal climax.
Wade in the water, child, wade in the water. Wade in the water, child, wade. Let the flood swell. Let the flood swell. Let the flood swell.
It's a pretty cool song. It's definitely miles ahead of their first EP, which is, I don't want to say formulaic, but it doesn't have anywhere near the same ambition as this, or even quality of playing. And yeah, and then moves on to Crowquill, which is like a more condensed version of the last song.
Yeah, it's got this song quite early on. I think it's about 40 seconds. Just for about 10 seconds, drops into something that sounds a bit like Slint.
Is it the rising roof line that makes me feel so swallowed whole? Or the way my body barely reaches the sky?
As a century where the virgin blood is passed.
Yeah.
But when it comes back, it's quite blasty. I mean, as you said, it's not blast beat because they're not quite good enough, but it's doing a sort of a nod to blast beat.
As Peter and run when you can't see the crowd from that lane. This perch is so far from the nest. Gravity doesn't grant me the privilege of failure. My bonus.
The song sort of shambles about a wee bit. Like it does that thing where it jumps from idea to idea to idea, and that's okay. It's cool when you're, I don't know, it's cool at the time, but it just, again, like it affects the longevity. Yeah.
I think I do fundamentally agree with that. The thing I like about this song was the call and response vocal, which the Blood Brothers obviously did quite a lot of as an artist, as a couple of artists, I suppose. It does kind of shamble about, you're right. I know the idea of it was to feel like it falls apart in the middle, but it really does fall apart in the middle before coming back in, with one riff and then off kilter. I think, does Craig call it a gravity blast? It's not like a real blast, but it's close to the Death Heaven blast, but he calls it because it's not quite a proper blast. Yeah, and it's a nice little doomy bit at the end, which is quite brief and does speak to the sludge of this desert savannah.
Can I just check, a gravity blast, I take it, is because of the way blast beats are played, where you're kind of like balancing it and leaning on it to get that propulsion down. Gravity blasts are where the drummer can't quite do that, so they're sort of relying on the weight of the stick to take it down, so inherently the speed of the blast is limited by that fact, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
There you go, public service announcement.
That's it, yeah. And A Nervous Light of Sunday was actually the song that really stuck out to me when I first heard the album way back when I was a wee guy, just because the riffs are really good.
I'm afraid woman's work is never done, but the final stitches got to come, and so researchers contend to slice through
there's some really nice big chunky and discordant parts in it, which I really, really enjoyed.
I think about 1:10 it goes into this quite gallopy bit. It's one of the stronger moments in the record, although some of the vocal dropouts in this, I don't know why, because they're an American band, but the accent just made me cringe fucking really hard.
Compromise nothing, but that which secures a comfortable life. Risk as the indication of a healing sacrifice. Destroy the altar.
Yeah, see that bit from 1:10 to 1:34. He's just doing every single kind of drum fill we can think of, one after the other.
Good for him.
It works, man. It works. And again, they do, like I said at the start, they do the whole loud, quiet, loud thing, just chucking it in wherever. It seems as though there's no rhyme or reason. It's just, should we maybe just like calm down the mentalness for a second and do something quiet? Okay, instead of maybe doing something a little bit more slower, maybe.
More slower, my favourite.
More slower. And there's a quiet bit towards the end which has a harmonised vocal, which is pretty cool. They don't really do that ever. Do it a lot on the next album. That might have just been accidental.
They were going for the same note.
Yeah. It's also layered. That vocal at the end is like quite layered as well, which is pretty cool. And then it's Interview at the Ruins.
Piano intro. It's a nice wee pacer. I think certainly coming off the back of the last tune where I was getting a bit fatigued, it's good.
This is actually, I think this is my favourite track, just because it slows it down a bit and it just gives you a bit of space, but it's also got that kind of, I think by the end of it, it builds, it kind of reminded me of Hope's Fall, remember that band? Yeah. And how they kind of build a few things, and it really worked for me actually, and maybe even like slower Poison the Well stuff as well.
Yeah, it's quite when you take your foot off the gas and let things breathe, it feels really sinister.
For a minute, it's over.
So how did it end? Can you describe his final words?
Broken windows, plastic eyes.
Can you tell us what happened here?
Which is cool, and they do a lot of atmospherics in it as well in places when it's quieter, which is I think this song really works because it has that almost metal feel to it in terms of the key or the sort of chord choices and stuff like that.
I mean, it's at this point in the album where the songs get a lot longer. They all start kicking into like 6 minutes even and more. As I mentioned earlier on about the fact that they were a trio at this point, there's something about this tune in particular that kind of occurs to me as a musician, and having gone to see these kind of bands as well, where they don't translate very well live. There's a really key guitar part in this where the guitar's doing one thing and then there's a little guitar refrain playing over it. And I'm thinking, okay, so when they played live, did they do the refrain, in which case all the guts of the song would disappear, or did they do the gutsy bit in which case the hook of the refrain disappears, because they did spend a wee while as a trio, and I can't imagine until they got the fourth member that this song would really have worked live, because also the piano stuff, I'm guessing they weren't touring with the stage piano. So I feel, as much as this is a strong point in the album, this probably didn't really work in the live set for a long time until the band had that bigger lineup or were able to tour on a slightly bigger budget, if that was a thing. I mean, I do think there's some interesting vocals on it. I think about 4.5 minutes into it, there's like a kind of melodic sort of gang sung refrain thing, and it really reminded me a bit of the bands like Modest Mouse, and also Pinback, some of those lighter influences and much more intricate and interesting indie post-hardcore bands. So it's definitely a decent bit of music, but yeah, I'm just not convinced about whether or not they would be able to pull this song off in a way that would work live. I think you may actually be quite disappointed if this was your favourite track in the album and you saw them trying to do it as a trio. You'd be like,
yeah, that's I think it's a fair point. It follows up with Non-Objective Portrait of Karma.
so I think this is the best one on it.
It's got a really big post-rock feel, this song, so I'm not surprised by that.
I'm a massive Godspeed You Black Emperor fan, and for about the first, 3 minutes 40 seconds, this sounds like a Godspeed You Black Emperor track, with all the drones and those kind of weird stringy things. I think that 3.5 minutes at least is the best passage on the album, even though it sounds very little like the rest of the album. They actually do that stuff pretty well. The Screamo introduction, I think when the vocals land on this, it's actually also the best example of that on the album, because it doesn't sound forced or contrived or over-egged.
And finally I'll sleep, and I'll sleep through the night. On the street corner, cover, study of a face and a figure, surveying this language as a game surveillance.
It's really well judged, and it fits well. Even coming out of that post-rock thing, they did a good job of it. I just think as a song, it fits together quite nicely. It doesn't feel hurried. It contrasts well, but it does. There's a sense of it having been workshopped really well. I was impressed with that song, actually. I hadn't heard it before, despite having some tracks by them, and it was good.
I like the shimmery sort of delay reverb effect they've got in that intro. I guess the first movement of the song, shall we say. And see, when it does give way to the total chaos, the interplay of the vocals works really well for me, and I think that is the best on the record of them doing that, for absolute sure. It does have a really weird sort of choir bit at the end, just for like 20 seconds, which is just utterly bizarre.
You're only going to release 2 albums in your career, then.
Yeah.
Might as well get the choir in.
And I've got Kill the Switch after this, which kind of feels as though it should have been the last song.
I would agree with that, because I totally tuned out this album by the last song. What happened was, around about the point in this song, I was like really struggling to tune back in and focus on it every single time. It does have some decent points. I mean, there's a cool dropout at 1:10 in this one. Kathy takes a lead, or at least the equivalent of the lead, a lot. There's a fucking disgusting use of phaser pedal at 3 minutes 23 seconds that is really, really awful. But I think just Kill the Switch doesn't know when to stop as a track. It just doesn't know when to fucking quit. And then because of that, the final track's a write-off for me, because I'm just like, I am totally battered.
Yeah, so I've kind of written, this is the band basically going full tilt, and it's actually quite hard to take in. There's like a whirlwind of different hardcore and noise rock shit happening all at once. There's just a riff, and a different riff, and a different riff, and a different riff, and it's dead. It cuts about too much, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's so many ideas. Yeah, throwing it all at the wall.
It's even got a fucking wood block in it. at 3 minutes 34, which is just completely bizarre. And I've written here, I enjoy the build up after that part, but the song's just exhausting, and it must have been fucking exhausting. It must be exhausting to play live as well.
Yeah,
because it's like 9.5 minutes long. Some things like about it, it's got a really nice push and pull. I think the guitar work goes in a lot of different interesting directions. If they'd just like maybe grabbed a few bits and hung on to that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing though with Screamo bands, they frequently stumbled across pretty good riffs or even grooves, and then they just immediately dispensed with them. They didn't know how to they didn't know, they just didn't want to, but I get it just doesn't match my sensibilities. I'm also very aware of right now how there's probably some real super fans screaming at this podcast. Like, we're in a territory where we're dissing arguably the most celebrated album of the genre, and we're sort of not dissing it outright, but we are giving it
finding fault.
We're finding fault, and I am very aware that people are probably a little bit unhappy with.
And then as a Crater to Coffin after that, which is actually a pretty good song. It's just a shame it sits where it sits. It reprises the motif from the start of the album throughout on guitar.
It doesn't get a fair
really
chance
doesn't.
because of what it's coming after.
It feels even more climactic than Kill the Switch, and I understand why they made this the last song, because it feels as though it should be the last song as well, but Kill the Switch probably should have been elsewhere, or shorter, or more succinct,
or 2 tracks, or
something like that. The main riff in this song is really hypnotic. And I really like the flow of it when they bring in the heavy guitars. They come in gradually as opposed to all at once, which is like a really interesting thing that they haven't done yet on the album. They pull it back around 2 minutes, around 3 minutes 40, and you do another little bit of nice vocal interplay, and then it's just a really big outro, which is also again, by this point in the album, like you said, Chris, you're pretty exhausted anyway. So they have another song, which is the last song's 9 minutes, this one's 10. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, it's maybe not got as many moving parts. It's still a bit of a slog, I think, because that big riff at the end and bringing that big riff back to the melody that starts the album is super fucking clever, and it just sounds heavy as balls, but the song is just way too long.
It's at the center of the storm.
You know, and it's a shame because just what's come before it detracts from it, which is a bit of a shame.
You know, it's fun. I mean, this is the most boomerish take on this album going, because imagine if we could all go back to our 20-year-old selves and review this album.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, think
absolutely.
about how different our take, like, fucking this awesome bit, and then he does this bit,
and he just keeps doing different bits, and he's so angry, and it goes.
I mean, it is incredible how every 5 years we reviewed this album, how different our perspective on it would get.
Yeah.
We're just jaded and old, and we don't get it anymore, maybe. But I just don't think this kind of stuff is translated as well. I mean, we've done albums way older than this that still seem a lot more vibrant and relevant. It's not really working for me. I mean, when you compare it age-wise to the likes of Jane Doe, it doesn't even come close, you know, and in terms of still, like, re-listenability, not even the same fucking ballpark. That said, it's maybe just a slightly more perishable genre than that, and it was a very good example of that at the time. I remember thinking that. It should almost certainly go in sense of people who aren't familiar with the genre. If you want to have some grasp of the history of the genre, this is a very, very seismically important record in that. I am just speaking on a personal level. I'm not a huge fan of it now, but historical me is insisting that it goes in. Pragmatic me is insisting that it goes in. So yeah, I think it should go in, but I don't want to hear it for a long time.
Yeah, I'm happy for it to go in, and I understand it, and I kind of get it. It's like when we listen to a hardcore record, it doesn't have the things that I grab onto, but I appreciate it and I kind of admire it, but it also makes me want to go and listen to Poison the Well or Glassjaw or Fear Before the March of Flames,
or
because
Enya.
they do, or Enya, yeah.
Mhm.
Just because they do, but they don't do this better, but they do
What they
this more like what I like. But that's fine.
Yeah.
But I totally get this record.
I think this particular era in this genre is not as impactful as the one that followed, which is still reverberating to this very day. Arguably, there's maybe not as many interesting records out the second wave than there is in the first one. I wish that, now that I reflect upon this, having done Screamo and listened to all of it for the past week, I wish this band had made this record 2, 3, maybe even 4 years later.
Either that or earlier.
Or they could have just done another record sooner.
Yeah, I mean, because I think if they spent more time becoming better musicians and thinking about being better songwriters, I think they could have done. Because
like, what would have happened if they did another record in 2006?
I think the thing is, though, because as you say, the genre it didn't explode, but the genre got much bigger, right? It got much more high profile. The thing is, so many people have so much love for this album because it feels more personal. It felt more like
it feels more like a little small project between your pals.
Yeah, more like esoteric knowledge, more like more kind of like, wow, we have this beautiful thing that we found from the States, and it.
Yeah, and if you were there, it burned brightly, but it burned quicker.
Yeah,
you know?
and it just
that's
felt more intimate, and and that is possibly why it's easier to hold it very close and almost be quite protective about it, and probably why people are currently screaming at the podcast about what fucking idiots we are.
Yeah.
But this was a personal period for this. This is, people probably feel about this the way I felt about some of the really fucking excellent early to mid 90s alternative stuff, where it felt very special. And
how I felt about Hybrid Theory.
Whenever I thought about this kind of style of music, and anybody ever spoke about liking this band, I'd be like, oh yeah, man, I fucking love that record, but I wouldn't listen to it very regularly. Having to let a little bit of that go to do this podcast, I actually feel kind of better for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because I do still like this album a lot. I don't listen to it regularly. I'm not going to listen to it regularly going forward. I listen to it more than any other contemporaries.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like a jumper that you had at the time. You probably overwore it, like worn through, and now it kind of maybe looks shit and it's out of fashion, but how lovely that jumper was to wear for that year and a half.
Yeah.
And you remember
analogies, man.
You remember winching somebody really nice to that in that jumper. You remember somebody borrowed it, and you just have a lot of good memories with that jumper.
Yeah.
But it's fucked now, and you shouldn't wear it, but it's still in your drawer.
I'm kind of more in the mindset of like, right, we might put a few emo kids' noses out of joint, but they're fucking emo kids. What the fuck are they going to do? They're going to fucking write about us in your diary. Who gives a shit?
If they're still emo kids now, there's definitely a problem.
Well, yeah, exactly.
They probably got emo kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, Nexus.
A complicated series of connections between different things.
Yeah,
Cool.
Marcus, it is your turn.
Okay, so Circle Takes a Square. They released both of their albums on the record label Robotic Empire, which is owned by the guitarist of Page 99, a guy called Mike Taylor. In the 2010s, specifically 2014, 2015 and 2016, they released 3 tribute albums to Nirvana, one for each of their albums. And on each of the records, they contained a bunch of covers by different bands. So you had like bands like Boris and Cave-In and Torch and Touche Amore and stuff like that. A lot of really cool bands like doing various versions of...
Cave-In did Territorial Piston?
Yeah, they did. That's right. On that record, Boris covered Lithium. Such a pretty cool cover. Speaking of Nirvana covers, another really famous cover of Lithium is by the Polyphonic Spree.
I don't care, I'm so horny, that's okay, my will is good.
Remember them?
Yeah. The song is
The
actually
Welsh Slipknot.
yeah.
The festival production office's nightmare. How many fucking meal tickets?
That song's actually featured in the film The Big Short, which also features Christian Bale playing Dr. Michael Burry, who was one of the guys that originally really uncovered the sort of subprime mortgage
Scandal. Yeah.
before anybody else would believe him. And what was it he did? He basically shorted the position and lost a lot of money because he was convinced it was going to happen. And it did eventually happen, but everybody was raging at him. Michael Burry in real life is a really big metal fan, and like as true to his character in that, he did love to play drums too. In the film, Christian Bale actually plays really badly, but he is actually playing the drums to the Pantera song "By Demons Be Driven." There's also a scene in the film where Michael Burry he ignores somebody who's sitting in front of him telling him to fuck off, basically by putting his headphones in, and the song that plays when he hits play is Blood and Thunder by Mastodon. Anyway, that song's about Moby Dick, which was written by Herman Melville, and he wrote Bartleby the Scrivener. But also,
we never said we're going to Bartleby the Scrivener.
Yeah, I was waiting until he finished, but we could just say it now. We're going to Bartleby the Scrivener. Who chose it? It was somebody off Twitter.
Panfish.
Yeah, Doki Doki Panfish.
Just cut that back in.
No, I quite like the sort of
irregularity of it.
Yeah.
But also,
it's like a Circle Takes
it's
the
like
Square.
Scramz.
Yeah, totally. But also, in that short story, Bartleby the Scrivener works for a lawyer on Wall Street, which is also where The Big Short is.
Very good.
Yeah, so.
All right, Circle Takes the Square. They actually collaborated with 65 Days of Static on their third record, 65 Days third record, The Destruction of Small Ideas. I think it's just on the last song, The Conspiracy of Seeds. 65 Days of Static, excellent post-rock band. I don't know how many records they've done now. They're still going, but I
think it's interesting that they're still seen as a post-rock band because they're really into the territory of electronic.
Oh yeah, like
stuff now.
Yeah, definitely.
They're a bit like Vessels. Like they've really transitioned.
They do. They moved into after they did the soundtrack for No Man's Sky, and then
in 2016 they did the soundtrack for No Man's Sky.
Hang on, are you going to mention about the music on that album? On that soundtrack, it's all procedurally generated, so they've been working with now all they really do is work with computers to create music which is procedurally generated.
I was going to mention that.
Okay, cool.
But I mean, the game is also procedurally generated. What was really interesting about that game was like it came out with a whole load of hype. And I actually remember we got asked to put on 65 Days of Static in Glasgow Science Centre in the the sky, the
planetarium
in the sky bit, where you see the sky, as a launch show for this, but then it never quite
What's
worked
the
out.
capacity of the sky, Dave? How many tickets you overselling that one by?
Well, standing only. But I just realised how bad the reception was to No Man's Sky.
Yes,
like
really bad.
I remember when it came out and people were like, oh, it's actually a little bit boring, and compared to what we thought. But there was fucking like death threats to the developers. They had to get Scotland Yard in to like,
wow.
But I mean, eventually I think the advertising authority and everything said, oh no, they've done what they said they would do. It's just not as good as you thought it might be. But apparently it's also got better.
It works now, like I said,
because
it was
it's developed. Over time.
Taking like 5 years.
Anyway, one of the huge influences for No Man's Sky was the work of Arthur C. Clarke.
Of course.
Along with like Isaac Asimov and everything, but they directly took a few things from specific Arthur C. Clarke novels and works. Arthur C. Clarke, of course, co-wrote the screenplay for 2001: A Space Odyssey. 2001: A Space Odyssey, possibly the most influential sci-fi film, apart from maybe Metropolis. It's really fucking good.
It's alright,
but so is 2010.
Yeah, 2010.
That is a fucking unsung movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also very famous for its score, its use of classical music, which I mean have parodied and copied and everything. But the score, as well as I guess the film, just its sci-fi and space base, was a big influence on the soundtrack to Moonraker, the 1978 or 1979 Bond film.
So actually that late it was made? I thought it was a 60s film. Fuck.
Yeah, no, Moonraker was the one that came after Star Wars, and they went, oh fuck, we should put James Bond in space. So they put James Bond in space. But what's actually interesting is watching that film, the first hour and a half is actually pretty class as a Bond film. It's like really well shot, amazing locations. They're in Brazil and they're in France and stuff. And then just the last hour, they go to space and they have lasers, and it's and then there's
Austin Powers.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the double entendre. What are you doing? I'm just attempting re-entry, sir. But anyway, the bad guy in Moonraker, Hugo Drax, was played by Michael Lonsdale, the famous French actor. And that famous French actor, Michael Lonsdale, also played the character of Bartleby the Scrivener in the 1970 version of that thing on film. I think there's been 4 versions, and he played it. Did it in 1970.
That's cool. Really good.
All right. Circle Takes a Square from Savannah, Georgia. By the way, Savannah, Georgia had the first black church in America. It's built on the site of a key site from the Underground Railroad. Savannah, Georgia was, as a city, gifted to Abraham Lincoln by General Sherman on his big march south, his big ultra-violent march south. He spared Savannah, Georgia because of its beauty, having already burned down Atlanta. But it was Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas present.
Nice.
That is nice.
The Abraham Lincoln Museum in Illinois houses the largest collection of Lincoln artifacts, but it also, as of 2017, contains a series of letters by a certain Mr. Charles Manson. Now, I don't know why Charlie Manson has letters in that museum. I'm not really sure. I think he maybe sent them to a journalist, and when he died, the journalist felt compelled to sort of submit them to posterity somehow. But anyway,
like, I think he tried to send them back in time, Abraham Lincoln.
The 1969 Tate murders, ordered by Charlie Manson, but committed by others. You know the story. I don't need to go over that. Led to 6 deaths, including Sharon Tate's unborn child. And one of the other victims was celebrated hairstylist and also Sharon Tate's ex-boyfriend, Jay Sebring. Jay Sebring, that same week, had invited a rising young musician to the party, and that musician's real name was James Ambrose Johnson. Anybody know who that is?
Oh, fuck. No. Jimi Hendrix.
Is it Brian Wilson?
It's Rick James, bitch!
Oh, wow.
Rick James was meant to be at that party, and he didn't go. Guess why?
Because he was fucked.
He was fucking hungover to fuck. So Rick James missed that party. He would have been there had he not been so unbelievably hungover, because he'd bumped into Jay Sebring earlier that week and had been invited. Rick James, fucking total fucking disaster of a human being.
A maniac.
Died at 52 or something of a heart attack. He also produced Party All the Time by Eddie Murphy, an absolute fucking belter of a song. Total slammer. Eddie Murphy's live show Raw from, I think, 1987. Is that right? Features a skit at the very beginning, which is, Eddie Murphy as a kid entertaining his family, and in that skit, one of his uncles is played by Samuel L. Jackson. In 2017's Kong Skull Island, Samuel L. Jackson modelled his character, Preston Packard, on Captain Ahab from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And Herman Melville wrote Bartleby the Scrivener.
Huzzah!
I think Kong Skull Island is the only actually good film from that whole series.
No, and you know what? I disagree in the sense that series now overlaps with Godzilla, and that first Godzilla one with Brian.
The first Godzilla was alright. There wasn't enough Godzilla. The Godzilla King of Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong. I literally had to turn them both off because they were so stupid.
But the first Godzilla one they did, what's his name? Is it Bryan Cranston?
Bryan Cranston, yeah.
The fucking size of Godzilla was just a relief, because he was just so fucking giant. That was amazing. Anyway, there you go.
Class. All right, what we doing next week?
Next week, I have decided to put the cat among the pigeons. I'm conflicted on it, but that's going to make for a really interesting episode, because it's not unsung. The band are absolutely not unsung, but this album in the context of their catalogue, I think is unsung because it landed really badly with their fans, and I don't think it spawned any particularly huge hits compared to their other ones. It is the album Humbug by the Arctic Monkeys. Now, fucking calm yourselves down. I know there's a lot of people just repulsed by that.
He's just slagged Screamo and then he's picked an Arctic Monkeys album. What
Arctic
the fuck is wrong with the
Monkeys
boy?
Humbug album is interesting because after 2 hugely commercially successful hip indie albums, this band decided to go and do something that seemed like an odd decision, but in doing so, I think changed the direction of their own careers and kind of took an audience with them, I think. Because it still amazes me that Arctic Monkeys, given some of the songs they put out, are as popular as they are. Not because I think they're awful, just because I'm like, this doesn't sound like it should be a big pop song. Why is it so famous? So yeah, I'm going to enjoy talking about that because I think there's a lot to be said about it. It doesn't equate to like a total endorsement of the band, but
yet
let's get into it. And we'll be nexusing the Arctic Monkeys. In fact, guys, I've done this every fucking time for the last few while. Somebody want to come over and do the honours? Mark?
Old man noises.
Dave, who are we nexusing the Arctic Monkeys to?
We are
so glad to be
going from Alex Turner and Co. to Baby Son from the Teletubbies. And that's Craig.
That guy.
Thanks, Craig.
So yeah, I'm sure we'll get there. Mark, reckon you can do it in one?
Maybe. I'll try.
Alright, join us next week for that.
Bye.
Bye.